I'm Maureen McCarthy, the Program Director for the National Security Forum, and I am joined by our speakers, Thomas Fingar from Stanford University, Ray and Keith, our duo from NSF, who you hear from quite a bit. So welcome to our new board members. We are very happy that we have now an active board with lots of great participation. And just in time as well. So with that, Tom, I don't want to cut into any more of your time, so I'm going to let you take it away. Tom will give us an overview of the situation from his perspective on the China nexus with the war in Ukraine. Ray Huffstutler will give some comments following Tom's talk, and Keith will kick off our Q&A. Again, for those of you who just joined us, please put your questions in the chat or Q&A box at any time during this talk. So with that, Tom, it's all yours.
Thank you, Maureen, and thanks also to Keith and Ray for inviting me back to NSF. This is my third appearance before your membership. I've titled my presentation, Ukraine and the Future of China-Russia Relations. That when invited to prepare this talk a few weeks ago, there was a great deal of conjecture, speculation, no small amount of Chicken Little-like silliness from my perspective about a return to a Sino-Russian alliance and the implications for Taiwan or the prospect of a threat that was pretty hyperbolic. It's toned down a little bit since, but there's still a rather, in my perspective, unhelpful proclivity to view China-Russia relations through a Cold War lens, but not a generalized Cold War lens, the lens of the 1950s, when there actually was a meaningful alliance between Moscow and Beijing that lasted from 1950 to about 1958. But this propensity to reach back to models and imagery of the past really ignores how much the world has changed. It exaggerates both the reality and the potential impact of a Moscow-Beijing partnership or axis, or its most extreme characterization and alliance. And third, it exaggerates the capacity of this partnership to solve the internal problems that both Russia and China have. And for reasons of both time and my own expertise, I'm going to focus on the Chinese side of the relationship. And I'm going to begin with a few key judgments, because I've asked Maureen to cut me off at 27 minutes to allow plenty of time for discussion, but you'll at least know where I'm headed in case I don't get there myself. And those key judgments are that the relationship with Russia is China's response to fears about imputed US threats, military, economic, soft power, political, to the regime. That's the starting point, a perception of threat. That the partnership is intended to deter imagined actions by the United States, not primarily intended to achieve revisionist goals, whatever that means to the commentator. I believe it should be viewed as a classic enemy of my enemy can be my friend arrangement. It's not driven by ideological affinity or meaningfully shared goals beyond constraining US freedom of action. That the fourth judgment is that the already thin and somewhat fragile relationship between China and Russia has been severely strained by the invasion of Ukraine and by the run-up to the invasion of Ukraine. And finally, that what's happened in and around Ukraine has further reduced what was already a low likelihood of PRC military action against Taiwan. I think the probability was very low before. In no way is it higher because of the events of Ukraine. Let me turn to how Russia fits into China's strategic calculus. By both doctrine and practice, Chinese policy is grounded on assessments of the domestic and the international situation. That those assessments shape determination of what is imperative, what's necessary, what China has to do, but also what's possible. The space, the realm of possibilities that with wise and effectively implemented policies can help achieve national objectives. That international situation was one that they determined, now going back a little more than a decade, was made more dangerous for China. That the unconstrained checks on the sole surviving superpower, American triumphalism, the fact that we didn't need China in a Cold War balance anymore, had made the United States more dangerous, especially in conjunction with the internal assessment that China's economy had become more fragile, as well as growing much less rapidly, and that this endangered social stability and the legitimacy of the regime. So dealing with those two big problems caused them to pull together a strategy in which the relationship with Russia became the centerpiece of the policy. That happened about a decade ago. To repeat, the driving purpose is to deter or to counterbalance US actions endangering China's growth and stability, or its more extreme version, endangering China's security from military attack. That the undergirding analysis in Beijing in some ways resembles, important ways, resembles that of late 1949, early 1950, that provided the rationale for the Sino-Soviet alliance. Protection from the US and Japan, the alliance specifies Japan, and assistance in developing the economy. But two critical differences between today and 1950 is there's no ideological content or affinity to it. And the Russians certainly are not a source of economic assistance, of models of aid, of technology, and the like. It's a short list of natural resources that the Chinese can buy from Russia or buy elsewhere. This lean toward Russia coincides with the post-2008 retreat from the policy of reform and opening that Deng Xiaoping initiated in 1978. It also coincides with a judgment after the 2008 global financial crisis that the United States had gone into terminal decline. That judgment was clearly wrong, but its importance here is that a declining United States would do everything within its power to prevent being overtaken or dislodged from its hegemonic position, in Chinese framing it, by the People's Republic. And that made us more likely to use military force before the military balance tipped in China's favor. We would use economic power before China's economy became larger and more varied, more capable than the United States. And before the United States lost even more ability to influence and bring allies and partners along with us in the international arena. These were not illogical judgments to have made at the time, but like so many other Chinese judgments over the last 70 years, they were fundamentally wrong. But they did shape policy. So aligning with Russia was to counterbalance the US threats. It's a relationship that is based on smoke and mirrors. The appearance of a closer relationship with Russia was judged to provide most of the benefits. Didn't have to have a great deal of substance in this. To repeat, it wasn't driven by ideology. It wasn't driven by any kind of notion of autocrats flock together and identify their common purposes to be pursued. And it's not driven by shared revisionist goals. It's pretty simple. They don't like US being in the #1 position. Neither one of them is prepared to move into that #1 position. So blocking us becomes the objective. China's goals are important, but they're limited. China certainly has not gone, in quotes, all in on Russia. And that can be illustrated with a few brief examples. That this tilt toward Russia began, let's say, about 2008. 2008, of course, is the year that Russia invaded Georgia and recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia. China was basically silent, did not recognize the independence of those two republics. And China, within the context of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which it took the initiative in establishing with Russia, but China took the lead within that organization to block the organization from recognizing the independence of those republics. In 2014, when Putin annexed the Crimea, China also didn't recognize it. It remained silent on it. That breaking up pieces of a sovereign state is not something China looks on with favor. Recognizing the independence of pieces of a country. Why not Taiwan? Why not Tibet? Why not East Turkestan, part of Xinjiang? So they have been silent, not in the cheering section for Putin's activities. That said, China has been very willing to take advantage of Putin's episodic or increasing over time isolation from the West. 2014, after Crimea, is a good example. Knowing that Putin needed a response to cutbacks in Western intentions to buy oil and gas, the Chinese finally agreed, after 13 years of negotiation, to build a pipeline from the Russian Far East down to China, gas pipeline. That had been under negotiation for such a long period of time because the reserves are small. And building the pipeline and exploiting those reserves was going to be expensive. So it only made sense if China got a low price, had to pay a low price for the gas. So they had Putin over a barrel, they agreed to do that. And then for those of you who follow energy history, the price of oil and gas plummeted. And the Chinese said, let's talk about this again, because the lock-in friendship price was now higher than the market price. This was looking out for China first, not helping out good friend Putin. In 2019, China and Russia upgraded their relationship to something described as a comprehensive strategic partnership of cooperation in a new era. I have no idea what that means. I welcome if any of you can tell me what it means. But it is the only such agreement that China has. It was established in the context of deterioration of China's relationships with the United States, with Europe, and with most of its neighbors. By 2019, opinion of China and all of its neighboring states and all of its major trading partners had deteriorated significantly from what it had been 5 years earlier. So Beijing sees a partnership with Russia as a way to check hostile actions and gain time to address domestic problems. This makes it, the relationship with Russia, a foundation or pillar of overall national policy. It's a key part of the security policy. Whatever the judgment they make about the likelihood of American or Western or imperialist military action against them, it's sure to be unrealistic from our perspective. There really are no prospects of doing that. But since they think it's real, they use the relationship with Russia for deterrent purposes. They see the relationship with Russia as making it less necessary to bend over backwards, in their view, to keep the Americans happy, so that we will continue to keep markets open and technology flowing and universities receiving Chinese students and access to American capital and technology and the like. So though there's not a lot of there's not a lot of beef in this relationship, Beijing can't disengage from Russia without triggering a thorough review of the whole array of national policies that it's due to announce at the Party Congress in a few months, in October or November. They've been banging out these policies for the last 3 years. It's comprehensive. It's education, it's defense, it's industrial policy, it's healthcare, it's elder care, how much can be spent, what's necessary in order to achieve goals in other sectors and the like. It's a comprehensive approach that if they knock out the Russia pillar, they've got to contemplate reviewing everything, which means they've got to reopen the debates within the top leadership that clearly have gone on, clearly been very intense. And at least the losers in those debates would welcome the opportunity to reopen them. And there's enormous reluctance across the leadership to do that, because you can't know where it might go. And they might not be able to contain it within the top leadership of the party. It might spread out into the public. I'll be happy to elaborate that if you care. So bottom line, there's much less to this relationship with Russia than they would like us to believe. But that background, I think is important to understand and interpret the impact of Ukraine. And I'll shift to that now. That, as you're certainly as aware of there was a deluge of commentary on whether, how China would assist, support, respond to the invasion, give Putin support as he lost access to Western markets and technology and money, and a smaller but still very significant amount of commentary on how China would use this as an opportunity to move militarily against Taiwan. There was much less commentary, although it's beginning to appear now, on how Putin's actions, and as importantly, how the West's response to Putin's action have affected PRC thinking. So I'm going to do a quick march through my analysis of how events and politics have affected politics and policy in Beijing And I'm going to do so by clustering them in four intertwined strands of shaping factors. The first starting point is that the party is finalizing decisions to be ratified at the 20th Party Congress. The media commentary here has focused on a third term for Xi Jinping. In my opinion, whether he gets it or not, and no reason to think he won't, that's far less important than the policy framework that's been hammered out over the last several years. These set national priorities, and they formulate policies to achieve them, and they allocate resources for implementing those policies. And they're linked to personnel appointments to lead and execute these party decisions. If you change the relationship with Russia, you got to revisit all of the derivative policies. And since Mao's death, there has been enormous reluctance within the party elite to expose the existence of fights, to, in the jargon of China, to expose them to the masses, to bring in the public, keep the fights internal. Party discipline obscures the disagreement, but it doesn't eliminate them. The second strand of factors entail critical PRC judgments about China's economic capabilities, about US power, US decline, and the willingness of developed countries to sustain China's rise. Beijing depicts its economy as conveying great amounts of both hard and soft power. And in rather ham-handed fashion, it has attempted to utilize that power to influence several countries, not least of which Europe. You should recall the retaliation against Lithuania for allowing Taiwan to open an office that had the word Taiwan in the title, banning any exports from Lithuania and then extending that to the entire European Union, banning any import that included any component from Lithuania, and it evoked a very strong reaction from Europe. PRC leaders know their economy is fragile. Now more say about that. But they judge that Europe, Japan, and even the United States will continue to accept asymmetries in the relationship, to tolerate PRC questionable to bad behavior because of our own imputed economic dependence on China and greed of the capitalist system. This strand includes judgments about the West. It included NATO being very fragile and likely to be rendered even less likely to act together because of the China-Russia partnership and the waning confidence imputed to their view of the United States. But the amazing degree of unanimity among developed democracies and the ability to impose painful sanctions on Russia knocks the legs from under this key policy assumption. The third strand centers on China's, quote, special relationships. Part of the fabric designed to protect security and promote economic growth and take advantage of competition among countries and companies is that China has a great array of what it calls special relationships. I noted the comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination in a new era with Russia, but it has about 40 other what they call comprehensive strategic partnerships. It's unclear what these relationships mean. It's unclear whether all relationships with the same title mean the same thing. But I think it's fair to say, whatever they are, they're not viewed as meaningless by either the Chinese or the partner state. It also has ordinary strategic partnerships, as it does with Ukraine, which it concluded in 2011. But with Ukraine, it also has an equally vague security commitment from 2013 that makes reference to some kind of obligation on China's part if Ukraine is attacked by a country with nuclear weapons. Doesn't say with nuclear weapons, so the country with nuclear weapons. And China has about 20 of these partnerships. That means that the PRC in about 60 countries will, at least in theory, take a look at these relationships in China and say, what the hell do they mean? And what does the strategic partnership with Ukraine mean if the Chinese decided they had to rearrange their sock drawer when the Russians invaded? And that brings me to the fourth strand, which is self-awareness of PRC vulnerabilities. Despite the recent narrative on PRC strength, narrative inside and outside of China, the leaders know how fragile that economy is. And therefore the society and the political system are. This is a performance-based legitimacy. Growth is now projected to be 5.5% for this year. Because of the COVID lockdown, they won't make that. And nobody inside or outside of China that I'm aware of has it higher than 3 to 4% for the next few years. And everybody has it going down after that. That means the large infusions of cash resulting from high levels of growth are not going to be there to meet growing number of demands. And that's one of the reasons they fear US action to effect regime change, vulnerability of their economy. They need to keep us on board in order to sustain growth and to sustain legitimacy. It's not just the US, it's the US, the Europeans, and the Japanese. But Beijing had angered all of the
27-minute warning.
Thank you. All of the key partners before the invasion of Ukraine. Now, in order to turn directly to specific related to Ukraine, let me do a couple of things very quickly. That Biden's announcement of the buildup next to Ukraine, the way in which he used intelligence, publicly with the Europeans, but privately with China, going back to December. We know that because the US announced it after the fact in early March. Basically, he said, we're not trying to contain you and isolate you. What could be more of a common interest than blocking the invasion of a sovereign country? I think the primary intention was to make sure in the Chinese leadership, they had information about what the Russians were doing that they almost certainly had, if not in as great a detail, from their own intelligence collection capabilities. Some nimnuts acted with outrage that the Chinese would tell the Russians about it. I'm sure it's exactly what the administration wanted them to do, which put them in a position of having to ask Putin what he's doing. And he either lied to them or he blew them off. Either way, it's not so good for the relationship. There's no way to spin the Ukrainian events as favorable to China. We don't know exactly how they played out, but either they adopted a don't ask, don't tell when Putin went to Beijing for the opening of the Olympics, or they asked and Putin blew him off, or he told him what he was going to do, and the Chinese said, you might want to rethink that because we have interests in this contest, and he blew those off. That it's left China with a position they can't back away from Russia, but they can't support it either. They can't support him materially, financially, so they support him politically. They repeat the Moscow arguments, it's all NATO's fault because of the threat that a possibility of including Ukraine posed to Russia. So now China is in a position where it can't back away, but it can appear to be too close. And there were specific things that he did, like the recognizing of Luhansk and Donetsk, that really is a bad precedent for China. China views that as bad precedent. US has rallied NATO allies to unprecedented and unexpected joint action with prospect of secondary sanctions on any country that violates them. The sanctions are rough on Russia. If secondary sanctions were imposed on China, that really jeopardizes not just the economy, not just the plans for the next 5 years plus, but the stability of the regime. So they'll continue, China will continue to condemn sanctions in general. They'll condemn and refuse to join the sanctions against Russia, but they're also not going to violate them in a significant way. They'll always push the envelope because they're Chinese, but they're not going to risk anything that would cost their access to SWIFT, for example. And finally, what does this mean for Taiwan? Well, if Russia has trouble moving across the line on a map, a line on the ground to take Ukraine with the equipment that it has, 100 miles of water has got to look more formidable. That whose tactics and to some extent weaponry and joint training has China participated in since it leaned to Moscow? It's Russian. It's hard to reach a positive evaluation of the performance of that military and that equipment in there. But most striking is the efficacy of Biden's sometimes lead from behind, European unity, Japan signing on to the sanctions. And as somebody that's watched the world for a long time, when you get the Swiss signing on to collective action by NATO, boy, that better get your attention. We're in a whole different era as this alliance and partnership is moving to an alliance in defense of interests and values, not simply defensive territory. Let me stop there.
Excellent, Tom. Thank you for that excellent summary and behind the scenes insight into what your perception is of what's going on in China. I'm going to turn it over to Ray. I've got a few questions, but and again, people, you're welcome to, NSFers, you're welcome to put your questions in the Q&A or chat boxes. Ray, I'll let you take it away. You're on mute, so you'll have to unmute yourself. Right. That does it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Marie. And thank you, Tom, for a thought-provoking presentation. Most of us are focused on the invasion of the Ukraine itself, the resulting flood of refugees, and the actions of the international community to punish Russia. But as Tom pointed out, there are major consequences of this invasion for other countries. The disruption of the Ukrainian-Russian wheat harvest, for example, is causing a food crisis in many parts of the world. I'd like to focus my brief comments on three consequences I think will affect China, the United States, and others. The first of these is the end of nuclear arms control as we have known it. American policy has pursued nuclear arms control as a means of dissuading states from acquiring nuclear weapons and abusing our own large nuclear arsenal as a deterrent to the use of such weapons by others. The general idea was to provide a nuclear umbrella, which would protect non-nuclear states, as well as minimize the risk that regional conflicts would escalate. When the Ukraine surrendered its nuclear arsenal in 1994, there was a trilateral process in which Russia, the United States, and Great Britain guaranteed the security of the Ukraine against an invader. And as Tom mentioned, later on, President Xi of China made a similar security guarantee. In 1922, Russia invaded the Ukraine, and President Putin threatened to use nuclear weapons if anyone intervened directly. The US and Britain have intervened indirectly by supplying arms, but no one will send military forces to the Ukraine. When the aggressor is a major power, a major nuclear power, it appears that no one will risk escalation by protecting the victim. Although I think the results would be different if Russia attacked a NATO country, most of the world does not belong to NATO. South Korea and Japan have already taken this lesson aboard. South Korea is talking about reviving its abandoned nuclear program, and Japan is undertaking a conventional military expansion, but may eventually decide that it's no match for China without nuclear weapons. Over time, this lesson from the invasion of the Ukraine may bring several nuclear powers to China's doorstep, a development which would greatly affect Chinese strategic aspirations. The second consequence I foresee, and one that is derived from the above loss of faith in international security guarantors, is the re-emphasis on conventional forces. The Russian invasion has shocked Europe and changed assumptions about the impossibility of war. European members of NATO have already vowed to reinvest in their conventional forces in the event that the nuclear umbrella doesn't work. In this, they join their Asian counterparts. Russia's goal of NATO's withdrawing from its borders is likely to be swamped by conventional forces buildup in Europe. China will see the same thing in Asia. And indeed, in this morning's paper, there's an article about Finland and Sweden considering joining NATO. This is not exactly what President Putin intended. Finally, this dreadful war will delay or derail worldwide efforts to deal with climate change, as key materials for clean technologies are sidetracked. Electric vehicle batteries, solar voltaic devices, and wind farms all depend on lithium, cobalt, and nickel. China dominates the mining and processing of these materials. But Russia is the second largest producer of cobalt and produces 10% of the world's nickel supply. Demand for lithium is expected to rise 20-fold by the end of the decade, and Russia is the world's fourth largest exporter. One of the world's largest lithium reserves lies in the Donbas region of the Ukraine near the current battle zone. Russia also produces 1/3 of the world's palladium and 12% of the platinum required for the catalytic converters of gas-driven vehicles. Shortages of these vital materials will not only disrupt the development of climate-friendly industries, but will give China additional leverage in its trade relations and also in its ability to avoid sanctions, as well as a competitive advantage in clean technologies. Thank you, Maureen.
Thank you, Ray. That was very helpful and pieced a lot of things together that we will be dealing with. We are actually looking to set up an energy security in-person program for NSF in June. So I'm really glad that you tipped off on and mentioned the issue of the supply of metal and natural resources for the alternative energy business. So back to the beginning, Tom, of your talk. You made a definitive statement, and I'm hoping that you can back it up with a little bit more insight as to why you felt the partnership between Russia and China was not based on political ideology, shared political ideology, and why it was more in the category of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. From the outside, it looks like there's some shared political synergies between the two nations. But why do you sort of put that aside as not a driving factor of what China is doing right now?
Thanks for the question. There is no international communist movement with an expansionist ideology, which was the case in 1950. the Chinese are not a proselytizing power. This is our system, that we are entitled to have our system, but they're not pushing it on others. I don't think the Russians are pushing theirs on, Putinism on others. There are elements of crony capitalism in both systems. I think they're much more extensive in Russia than they are in China. China is still more of a Leninist, structured, Stalinist, state-owned enterprise, industrial policy state. Russia doesn't have the degree of organization, coherence. The Chinese are, and see themselves as continuing to be, heavily engaged in the global economic system. The kind of points Ray was making at the end, because they think they will have leverage, even as they seek to be more autarkic in lots of areas, so that they can use economic relationship as leverage for others, and be relatively immune for it themselves. The Russians have such a commodity-based economy that their interaction has got to be very different. So what do they have in common? That they want things, they don't want the US unilaterally calling the tune for the world. They want as many issues as possible to go to the United Nations, because they both got a veto in the Security Council. They want to have relatively unstructured international arrangements where big powers can bully little powers, not multilateral groupings like NATO that are even a competent version of ASEAN, where countries act in tandem in order to gain leverage against bigger players. So keeping it on a bilateral rather than a multilateral basis, these are shared interests, but they're secondary, I think, to both of them. That what they need to do internally, and that trumps what they might aspire to do internationally. And internationally, it's not clear to me where the common interests are in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, and certainly not in Central Asia, where they're rivals. So all around their periphery, they're more competitors than they are complementary. And to the extent they look like they're carving up the region or having a unified purpose, they alienate the countries that they're worrying about managing in the soft underbelly or the vulnerable West. So I just don't think there's much there.
Got it. That's really helpful. And likewise, I think one more question about digging down into something you said. You said several times that for China to change its perspective and its relationship with Russia would trigger the reopening of all of its policies. Now, I can understand where that is true for international policies, but really basic things like domestic policies. Why does Russia have this seemingly outsized role in how they may be negotiating those policies? And is the timing being driven entirely by the Party Congress in the fall?
I think the timing of the Party Congress is important, but more important is the judgment that they have to have a plan, not a planned economy, but that it's a unitary state run in a highly centralized way. So it has very few shock absorbers in this. Our federal system, the role of the federal government is limited. It's unlikely that all 50 states make the same or complementary bad decisions at the same time. we rely so much on the private sector to do. The Chinese system is structured where they really believe they have to get it right and they have to administer it coherently, comprehensively across the country. And how does the security situation shape health policy, for example? Part of it's budget, politics. What you can do domestically is based on how many resources you have left over after you've taken care of your security policy. Now that's an overstatement. It's true to some extent in our own country as well. We've treated the national security requirements as driving. So part of it is how much money is there to allocate to all of these other things. And depicting the international situation, the threats, as being managed in part by this relationship with China. We can need to spend less money on defense because we got the Russians in our corner. Part of it is, are the Americans constrained militarily? Because that affects things like, where do you make next rounds of investment? And the Chinese history here, that 30 years under Mao, where they believed that attack was inevitable and imminent. That's what they said. And it meant that the prudent thing to do was to relocate or locate new industries far from the coast. To give up economies of scale in order to realize diversified deployment of them. That when Mao died, they took advantage of, move back where the people are, the transportation is, the coastal. But if that security relationship looks problematic, then you reopen up questions like, how do we adjust the inequities between the coast and the interior? How do we provide more jobs, more money, more development for the interior of the country, and kind of all across the budgetary aspects? And there are people who want more money for education in the rural areas. They'll argue it in terms of, we can do that because the Americans are held at bay by the relationship with Russia. And just to use one example. So does that get at it?
Helpful. Yeah, that's really helpful. Can we stick with you, Ray? I've got some questions on natural resources that you mentioned at the end, but I'm going to probably punt those to our energy security session. But I'm going to focus, Tom, on you. What does China think, putting on your China thought process hat, about Putin's nuclear saber rattling and even his unveiled and sometimes not so unveiled threats to launch attacks on existing nuclear power plants? How is the nuclear issue being addressed inside of the China discussions or the China government?
I wish I had more confidence in my answer, that this is an area that in the Chinese system is held very, very tightly. We have tried unsuccessfully for many, many years to get the Chinese to enter into talks. The Russians have tried with them too. Keith, long history in the arms control negotiations with the Russians. Mine isn't as long, but it is current, where the Russians worry about what China has and is doing. They worry that the Chinese don't understand what they are, what the Russians are doing, and don't understand what we are doing. And out of that uncertainty, feel they have to do things. I'm sure the Chinese are not happy with the nuclear saber rattling by Putin, in part for the first point that Ray raised, that it may be premature to pronounce nuclear arms control, the NPT, dead, but it's certainly going to be severely challenged to to dissuade countries that are capable of producing nuclear weapons to forego developing them because of Ukraine and because of Putin's threats. And for the Chinese, the kind of exemplar number one is North Korea. We make a big deal and wring our hands because the North Koreans have got a missile that may be able to launch a golf ball of death as far as Los Angeles at some point. But Beijing's only a couple hundred miles away. And they're fully capable of hitting it now. And the Chinese know that the North Koreans hate them there. And it's hard for me to assume that there's not going to be incentives and pressures to accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state. That the North strategy of, it'd be like India, that if you hold out for some period of time, you get recognized in it. And the Chinese will see Putin's nuclear saber rattling as contributing to intensification of one of their problems.
Got it. Yeah, that's really important. Keith, I'm going to ask you for some pointed questions, particularly on the China-Russia-Ukraine nexus, and then I'll go to some final questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Maureen, and thanks, Tom and Ray, for their lucid comments and for raising as many issues as they've been able to actually answer. But that's where we are, isn't it, in the real world? And I want to focus on what are the unintended consequences of what Putin has done and launched in Ukraine in a number of areas. And let me just tick them off. One, the one you were just talking about. What about North Korea? What about Japan? What about even Taiwan? Both countries at one point had nuclear weapon programs. We said our nuclear umbrella will protect you. You don't need to have them, but do they believe that anymore? Maybe they believe they really need to have them, to protect themselves against a nuclear North Korea, to say nothing of the unsettling nature of Russia, etc. Another unintended consequence, and Tom gets to something you were talking about, the cooperative strategic relationships that China has around the world. My understanding has been those have been largely resource driven. In other words, China's economy and internal growth depends on so many different networks of the influx of resources in Africa and different places that those relationships are critical to their stability as long as their economy is critical to the stability of the leadership. Next one is, what about leadership discord in Beijing and in Moscow? I mean, you read a lot now about, gee, is Putin on his way out? Is he ill? Is he going to die? Is he going to be like Khrushchev 2 years later, he's going to be gone? Or is he going to die in place like Brezhnev? What's going on there? But what about in Beijing? I mean, yeah, is he stronger because he's sort of holding his tongue about Ukraine, or is he now more vulnerable? And is there, as you mentioned, there is that one article that came out by a so-called academician, questioning what's going on among the leadership. And finally, Russia and its relationship to Europe. It's now been kicked out of the Council of Europe. You say, okay, big deal. Yeah, but what about the International Court of Justice? Is that a big deal? Mm-hmm. Particularly if somebody wants to take the Russians to court for genocide in Ukraine. Is Russia just going to blow that off and say, get out of my way, I'm going to do it my way or the highway? So there are a number of issues, I think, that get raised by what Putin has done in the Ukraine. And as you all have mentioned, the unanimity of NATO, the prospect of Finland and Sweden joining NATO, the prospect of Japan and other countries perhaps wanting to have their own nuclear arsenal for their own protection. I mean, there's just a lot of things that come to play. And this is, as we all know from our experience in international relations and the international environment, you push a button here and then all kinds of genies pop up somewhere else that you hadn't anticipated. So where does that leave us?
Yeah, well, it leaves us, I think, on the cusp of a lot of relook, rethinking, and maybe restructuring in the international system. And I'm not anywhere near smart enough to predict how that's going to play out because there's so many moving parts and so many uncertainties, Keith, as you pointed out. But let me make some brief comments on some of the points you raised. The impact on Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. And let me start with Taiwan. That I don't think it's going to make Taiwan want to go back, restart its nuclear weapons program, restart the nuclear program for a second time. We shut it down twice. I think a lesson they will have drawn from Ukraine is that this alliance of values idea, that NATO plus Japan, South Korea, Switzerland, Finland, that the developed democratic world, more explicitly than ever in my experience or reading, has identified a commonality of interests that go beyond the region, the territory, and Taiwan as the poster child for the kind of modernization and political transformation that we've desired around the world since the end of the Second World War. That's it. Taiwan now ranks higher on the Freedom House evaluation of democracies than the United States does. So it is, I think, would calculate that keeping the West in general and the US in particular having a high interest in their survival, that's more important than putting that insulation and protection at risk by pursuing an independent nuclear program. So I don't think going nuclear is a prospect for Taiwan, but because of that transformation of NATO from a purely defensive alliance, if that plays out, if that doesn't prove to be ephemeral. Japan, it calculated several times, besides the nuclear allergy kind of business from being the victim, that the concentration of its policy, of its population and its industries in the narrow coastal bands, because it's such a mountainous country, made it impossible to survive even a very limited nuclear strike, and therefore was irrational, and therefore could rely on the nuclear umbrella of the United States. My guess is that you're right, that they're rethinking that an independent capacity to inflict unacceptable damage on North Korea or China might be judged to be more possible and necessary than it was in the case of the Soviet Union. It was, why would the Soviet Union attack Japan? There's not that question with China or North Korea. So we gotta watch that. South Korea, the polling before the presidential election that just took place a few weeks ago showed that majorities in both parties supported the development of independent nuclear capacity. Now, I think that's a function of the way the question was asked. In light of North Korea having weapons, do you think South Korea should have nuclear weapons? You get a yes. If you ask the question, would you want to pursue an independent nuclear capacity if you knew that that ended the security treaty with the United States? Which I imagine would be our position going into this. I think you'd get a different answer on it. So the task for American diplomacy is going to be accelerated or modified in here. The leadership discord, and then I'll leave room for other questions, that I believe, sometimes with a lot of evidence, sometimes with no evidence, that leadership wrangling about assessments of what is possible, what is necessary, what is desirable, the best ways to do this, has gone on incessantly. That I started doing this in the mid-60s. I did my dissertation on the 50s. And over that entire span, there's always disagreement in the leadership, and sometimes it pops out, and other times it's constrained. And I can't believe that it's not going on now. Xi Jinping, I am in, I think, the minority, but it's not a minority of one, that sees Xi Jinping as a lot less powerful than he conventionally is depicted on this. He's picked by a collective leadership to be the front man for implementing collective decisions on it. There's effort to pump some charisma into him, and it doesn't work very well. But it makes him vulnerable. Has the way he's handled Ukraine made him more secure in his position or more vulnerable? I think he's the scapegoat in waiting. That you can sacrifice Xi to protect the party. You protect the party to protect China in their way of thinking about this. But great reluctance to dump Xi, I think, for at least two reasons. One is who the hell wants to clean up the mess afterwards? Because whoever comes behind is going to have a tough time and maybe see this as a losing proposition. The other is, I've judged that the reason they eliminated the term limits for that position, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, was to send the message to implement the policies and the programs that are coming out of the center. Stop dragging your feet. You can't wait this out. You can't wait for Xi Jinping to be succeeded by somebody else and review the bidding. Get with the program and carry out these retrenchment policies, which clearly are unpopular with a big segment of the Chinese elite. So I'm not predicting he's going to fall. I think the chances of him being maintained in position in order to maintain the appearance of unified thinking works in that favor. But everything about Ukraine and the way they have personalized this as the Xi-Putin friendship makes it easier to dump them.
Wow, Tom, thank you for that. That was some insight that I really appreciate. I'm going to end. We have some more questions, but I think we need to wrap this up now. I'm going to end with asking you, each one of the three of you, to give us, sort of your top 1 or 2 places where people can follow the information. So Tom, specifically for you, where would you recommend people look to get, besides your own writings, which we are posting, to get insight into what's going on with the China situation? What are some of the good resources you would point people towards?
There are a number of newsletters. I think the things that come out of CSIS, there's a China policy thing that comes out every couple of weeks, and they do a lot of stuff. The things that come out of Brookings, the Thornton Center, I think are quite good. That on the economy, I think what AEI does, they track a lot of stuff. It's compilation of stuff, and some of it analysts push a little hard on the political interpretation of it, but for the state of the economy, it's there. And finally, one is a China Leadership Monitor, which comes out of Hoover, but is a Minchin Pei and is now one of the editors. But it's a place where people get ideas out that doesn't have to go through lengthy peer review and delay in publication.
Excellent. Thank you. Ray, I'm going to ask you the same question pertaining to the sort of Russia side of the equation here.
Well, I would say briefly that a lot of the, just following the major news developments, newspaper developments and so forth will tip off a lot of the potential themes that that are going to affect Russia, not only in the short run, but in the longer run. For the economic business, basically, I chased through an awful lot of economic journals. There's no single source that would lead you to draw that conclusion. I think that's something that occurred to me, and I simply chased it down through research.
Excellent, thanks. And Keith, what are you reading these days?
I'm trying to stay wired with my, shall I call them my Cold War colleagues from state and other places who are sending me daily feeds on things, but periodically that come up from a variety of sources. It could be Foreign Affairs magazine, it could be the New Yorker, it could be all kinds of things where thoughtful pieces are written and published that people don't necessarily have, let me say, direct authoritative access. But I'm not sure there are many people that really understand exactly what's going on in Moscow anyway, and what's going on within the Putin collective of leaders. So I think it's pretty random. I just try to look at these things and find out who's putting some new ideas out, some thoughtful ideas that seem to make sense, not trying to guess who's right or who's wrong, but just how are these people kind of making sense of the uncertainty we face? And there's a lot of uncertainty.
Excellent, thank you. And I know many of us are also reading the Kyiv Independent every day and then catching the stories from the updates from Ukraine directly. So with that, I thank our speakers very much for an insightful discussion on a very complicated topic. I thank the NSFers for joining us today. Please note on your schedule, and then an announcement will probably go out by Friday or tomorrow on our next program on May 4th on the issues of food security that was mentioned here and what the impacts of global food security will be from the war in Ukraine. So with that, clearly this is a major issue. The war affects all aspects of national security. So we will be continuing this dialogue as we move forward. Thank you very much, everybody, and please stay safe.